Good evening from Washington, D.C. Much ink has been spilled in the run-up to Inauguration Day in praise of this moment in history. That's understandable. Barack Obama has become the first African-American president of the United States, and that is historic. But it would be wrong to invest the symbolism of this occasion with a sense of self-congratulation at a journey complete, or a breathless optimism of a new beginning. As President Obama takes up residency at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, he will lead a nation facing stiff challenges. Some, like the struggling economy and ongoing wars, are of the moment. Others, like poverty, health care, and racial injustice, stretch back deep into our nation's history. And to understand how this inauguration fits into our complicated national story, there's no better place to begin than this city. The hopes and disappointments of the American experiment are all evident here. Most cities don't have a date of birth, but Washington, D.C. was born and has grown up along with the United States.
We as a nation have always been conscious of our brief history, and this city's vistas are evidence of our need to connect to deeper roots. The mighty dome, a cathedral to democracy atop Capitol Hill. The broad avenues lined with the departments of government. And the stark memorials to revered presidents. A towering obelisk for Washington, the tallest structure in the city. The columned shrine for the martyred Lincoln emblazoned with his poetic words. And the reflective riverbank temple for Jefferson. All this marbled grandeur was meant to awe and inspire a young nation by evoking the ancient republics of Athens and Rome. But the glories of those republics were built in large part by men in bondage. And so too was much of this city in its early days. Slavery existed on both sides of the Potomac River and was not abolished here until the Civil War. 75 years later, with the statue of Lincoln looking on, Washington, D.C. witnessed another chapter in its complicated history with race.
April 9th, 1939, singer Marian Anderson performs in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. The concert, organized by Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is a concert of protest. Protest against the Daughters of the American Revolution, who denied Ms. Anderson the right to sing at Constitution Hall because she was black. Here at the alternate concert site, Marian Anderson draws an audience of 75,000.
But while Anderson sang about freedom and liberty, the city that turned out to hear her stayed segregated.
And a generation after Anderson's concert, a large section of the country remains segregated by law, and most of the rest of it by tradition. That's when the nation once again turned its attention to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There, a 34-year-old preacher, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., spoke poetically of the chasm between the rhetoric of our founding documents and the reality of our history. 5 years later, Dr. King was dead, the victim of an assassin's bullet in Memphis, Tennessee. For the people of Memphis, especially African Americans, it was the day the dream died.
It was like everything shifted into slow motion, and we were numb. We were dumbfounded. We didn't know what to think or what to believe at the time, and we really didn't know what to do.
Bill Atkins was a 20-year-old college student and only a few blocks away from the Lorraine Motel where King had been shot. Atkins knew what many did not yet know, that King was dead.
And I remember I burst into the door of the radio station. They apparently had not known, and there was a young man by the name of Joby Young was the disc jockey, and he was still playing the rhythm and blues music. And I broke in the door, and I said, "Take that stuff off. Dr. King is dead." And I remember Joe Young looking at me and saying, I didn't know. Okay, and he started playing gospel music.
Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life.
Today, Bill Atkins is Reverend Bill Atkins.
Martin's dream was a dream that digressed into a nightmare on the road to glory.
For him, and for many here at the Greater Amani Church in Memphis, that nightmare was twofold.
It was embarrassment for us because Martin was assassinated here. And the horror of that for us was that every black person in America would be mad at Memphis and everybody from Memphis. We were so hurt. Not that it just happened, but the fact that it happened here.
You're a preacher now, a
Yeah.
very effective one, very
Hope
popular
so.
one.
I hope so.
A very large church which has a very large youth congregation. Do they have the hope that Dr. King had?
I actually believe that we've lost a couple of generations. Sadly, so many things hit us socially, economically, impacted us from the period of the 70s to the 21st century. We were whammied on so many fronts by so many different things that affected us as a people. And it set us back, and we lost some of our kids. We lost their hearts. We lost their respect. We stopped parenting. We didn't parent our children the way our parents parented us. And we have seen the results of those generations, but now, as I said in my message today, now something has happened that I can see a future that's going to go way beyond my lifetime, that every child, every black child that's born in 2009 will be born with the first president of the United States, an African American. Now, that changes the whole nature of their thinking, of their self-awareness, of their state of mind. It changes everything for them. Would you allow me, just for a moment, to call the official roll? Would you allow me the privilege? George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, William Jefferson Clinton, George Walker Bush, and Barack Hussein Obama.
And if the congregation seems particularly joyous on this Sunday morning, they have good reason. Atkins and 110 members of the church will make the 900-mile journey by bus to Washington, D.C. to witness in person the inauguration of Barack Obama.
I knew that I wanted to go to the inauguration. I wanted to just be there and just to feel the electricity in the air, and it's nothing like that, and I think that's something that I would carry, for years to come.
I think it's going to be exciting, a lot of history. The age groups on the bus vary from children who are 6 years old all the way until people who've been around through the civil rights movement.
Barack pretty much encompasses what America has talked about. American called the melting pot. Well, that's about the most perfect example that you could ever have. A father from Kenya, another country, his mother is from America, they came together, had a kid, and all of a sudden he's going to be the president? What is this?
As an African American in this country, it just means there are truly no limitations. Sometimes people can say things, reach for the moon, and yeah, that sounds good, it's a good sound bite, but every time I try, there are things, you know what, there are no excuses, young men. You bust your butt, you work hard, and you'll achieve even the presidency of the United States, so no more excuses.
I think the world is watching us, and the world is expecting us to do something great. It's expecting the United States to come forward and do something great. And I think the world sees, in spite of all the problems that we have in the world, I think the world sees the anointing that's on Barack Obama, too.
We sold out 2 buses in 30 minutes, 110 passengers in total going to the inauguration. We could have sold 1,000, I believe, if we could have gotten the buses, but we couldn't get the rooms.
When he decided he was going to have buses, my name was one of the first names on the list. Never thought anything different about it. And people at my work, they are saying all the time, they were always saying, Miss Lucille, I know you're going to Washington. I'm like, yeah, you know I'm going to Washington. You know, to Washington.
What we're going to have this rope, because there's going to be a lot of people there. And this rope is going to be tied to our belt loop. Remember I talked about this?
We'll all be attached, okay?
Yeah, we'll all be attached.
So if Mom wants to go to the mall.
You understand? Because you're going to have 2 to 4 million people there. And if you're going to have 2 to 4 million people, that's a lot of people, right?
So y'all be yanking on you the whole time?
No, you just keep it
No,
up.
we won't yank on you the whole time.
I think he tapped into a totally new generation. And it's not just the fact that he's an African American. It's the fact that he's a good man. He's a family man. He's a husband. He has a clean record. He's not a dirty politician. I mean, it's so many reasons why I think the American people are excited about Barack Obama.
They're talking about the first president that they think really loves his wife. Like,
They're gonna be cold. They know it may be wet. They don't care.
The cold in Washington, D.C. will be no match for this jacket. No match.
I've got my long johns, I've got 2 pairs of socks, I've got Scully, the hunter's gloves that I hope I don't get in trouble for, heat packs, toe packs.
They just want to be there. They're going to be on that mall somewhere looking. They may be as much as 1,000 feet. They may be 1,000 yards from that podium, but they just want to be there and get a glimpse. President Obama may look like a little ant running on the steps. They'll be so far back, but that's all right. They want to be there so they can say that they were there when Barack Obama was sworn in as President of the United States. That's something to tell your grandchildren.
Father God, we just thank you right now, Lord, as we travel, Father, for this historical moment, Father. We thank you for allowing us, Father, to be found worthy, Father, to go and stand on the grounds, Father, as history happens, Lord. Lord, we say thank you for that, Lord. Now, Lord, as we go up this highway, Lord, we ask right now, Lord, that you see.
Come on, help me out now. I woke up this morning with my mind. Come on, it's upbeat. Stay on Jesus. Well, I woke up this morning with my mind. Stay on Jesus. Well, I woke up this morning with my, you know it was stay on Jesus. Hallelujah. Yeah. Hallelujah. I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine.
When President-elect Barack Obama raises his right hand and have his hand on the Bible and give an oath to protect the United States and to become Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America. I think the parade, that's a sidebar, and everything else. Once he does that, I'll probably cry again. Violation of man law.
Beyond the skies, it's been a long.
I didn't cry the night of the election because I was already so overwhelmed by it and watching the election from days to coming up and whatnot, all that. So I didn't shed a tear that night, but I think this time there will be tears. There will be tears.
To the movies, and I go downtown.
I think that the moment where it'll probably just hit the most is after his family come in and you see him standing right there. You know that this is the president. There's no more, he's president-elect, he's about to be, he may be. As of this moment, he is. And now we can go forward.
We're having this interview on a Sunday, and you preached your last sermon before the inauguration.
Yes.
When you next preach in this church that you and the congregation have built. You'll be preaching in a country that has a person of African American heritage as its leader.
Mm-hmm.
What's that like?
Oh boy, it will certainly be different. I don't know what the content of that message will be right now, but I do know that I will be a very proud American. America finally lives up to its creed, finally lives up to the words of Jefferson, who was a slave owner, to say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. America now lives up to all of its potential. America has always been great, but it's greater now.
I've got much to be happy about. Tell somebody you got something to be happy about. Hallelujah.
The church members heading to Washington for the inauguration were traveling to a city that has witnessed a lot of history. It is now the frenetic hub of the most powerful nation on earth. But at its inception, the capital city perfectly represented the nation it would lead. New, sparsely populated, and with audacious dreams for a future whose prospects were uncertain. Now, when we come back, Washington comes of age, and a conversation with a man who wants to lead it and other cities into the 21st century.
Missed an edition of Dan Rather Reports, or just want to see one again? We're now available on iTunes, so check us out.
Welcome back to Washington. The White House, the new home for the Obama family, was largely built by slaves. In fact, when the District of Columbia came to the banks of the Potomac River, it was squeezed between Maryland and Virginia, the two largest slave states in the Union at the time. Thomas Jefferson was the first president to be sworn into office in the new Capitol. He was one of at least 6 to bring slaves to the Executive Mansion, later called the White House. Much of the early city was built by slaves, and they worked alongside a number of free blacks who were eager for the work and were barred from employment in northern cities by white trade guilds.
Early Washington, D.C. was a quiet place, but with the seeds of a magnificent capital. George Washington hired French architect Pierre L'Enfant, and he used a grand European model of avenues radiating from squares and circles that give Washington, D.C. its many sightlines. The dramatic dome of the Capitol that has come to represent a unified nation was begun as the United States was breaking apart. When Lincoln was sworn in at the Capitol in 1861, the incompleteness of the American ideal could be signified by the building behind him. The Civil War changed Washington before it changed the country. 25,000 African Americans poured into the city in search of freedom, and Congress outlawed slavery in the district in 1862, a year before the Emancipation Proclamation for the nation. President Lincoln welcomed the former slaves and prominent abolitionists Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, the first African Americans invited to the White House. During the years of Reconstruction after the Civil War, black congressmen and senators came to Washington, but that era was short-lived. Soon the Supreme Court would sanction segregation in Washington and throughout the South. But black life in the district thrived. With the dawn of the 20th century, more African Americans were living here than in any other American city. There were signs of progress. In 1901, President Teddy Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House, a first that upset the city's Southern sense of gentility. Towards the end of the Great Depression, FDR reached out to the black community more than any president since the Civil War era, and in 1933, he began to desegregate the federal government.
And desegregation meant jobs for African Americans. Now, as we enter our own uncertain economic times, those on the bottom rungs of society are suffering the worst, and most of those are in the neglected inner cities and rural communities. One man is preaching that you can solve the job crisis and save the environment at the same time. A best-selling author, he's taking his message directly to the streets and the corridors of power.
I'm gonna have to sign fast, so. Okay, that's okay. That's good. You want to come with me? Let's come with me. That's good. Come with me.
You know, I consider myself a social uplift environmentalist. I consider myself an eco-populist.
I ain't gonna leave you.
My name is Van Jones, and I'm the president of Green for All.
Is this you? Yeah, that's perfect. Me. Listen, we need to talk.
We're working to get green-collar jobs in the solar industry, wind industry, organic food to disadvantaged people.
Give her your information. Let's figure out how to strategize.
I was not always an environmentalist. You know, I guess everybody has a soft spot for nature. Nobody hates trees or bunnies. I mean, so you know, it was that kind of an environmentalist, I guess. But I was mainly focused on kids. Kids in trouble, trying to get kids out of jail and into jobs in the urban environment. And I just burned out. And it was in trying to get my own health back that I started going to these retreat centers, meditation centers, and saw all this stuff in places like Marin County that we don't have in Oakland, like salads, you know, and tofu and solar panels, and it made a difference for me. And I also thought to myself, why don't we have this stuff in West Oakland? In the tough neighborhoods where really need healthier food, that really need cleaner air, that need the jobs that go along with that. So I had this slogan that came into my mind, and it was, green jobs, not jails. That was my prayer for the young people I had been working with in Oakland, and that started me on this journey. We're seeing a new kind of environmentalism. This isn't about conserving the beauty of our natural past, as important as that is and continues to be, or just regulating the problems of our industrial present. This is about investing in the solutions for the future. Hey, Diana, this is Van. I am calling about the meeting we're supposed to be doing in D.C. We have a chance to do something that no other generation has ever had a chance to do, to recreate the economy so that it's better for the planet, right? But it's also better for most people. We can build a green economy that Dr. King would be proud of, right? Get everybody working together across lines of class and color to reboot, retrofit, repower this country. Just retrofitting buildings alone, we could create 600,000 jobs within a year. That is the low-hanging fruit. You know, people say, green jobs, you know, they think we're talking about some outer space jobs. No, we're talking about taking our existing buildings, blowing in clean, non-toxic insulation, double painting glass, replacing furnaces and boilers that are 30 years old, totally inefficient, putting in those new ones that are very efficient. Why is that a green job? Because if a building's 30% more efficient, the power plant is going to put out 30% less pollution. 2 million jobs could be created in the next 2 years in this country if the federal government were to make about $100 billion investment. We're talking about a major overhaul of our energy system. We're talking about improving our grid across the country so that it doesn't waste so much energy. One of the best kept secrets in America is how much greening is happening in very unlikely places, even in places like Richmond, California, where you have poverty and crime and you're in the shadows of the Chevron refinery, this kind of monument to the last century's pollution-based economy. You see these new sprouts of a cleaner, greener economy beginning to emerge. We are at Richmond Build. We're in Richmond, California, very close to Oakland. And there's a program called Solar Richmond, and it's teaching these folks how to install solar panels. I can go up on the roof. No laughing at me now. If I fall, everybody got to show some sympathy. Everybody talks about solar energy and renewable energy, and guess what? If you don't have people who are trained to put up that technology and make it work, it's not going to happen. And Michelle is the master of training people how to do this work.
We're here at Crescent Park Housing, and this is actually the largest solar installation of a housing project in the whole country. And so Sunlight and Power is doing the work with some of our graduates from Solar Richmond. Richmond is called the city of pride and purpose, and unfortunately we're more known for pollution and violence than anything. And solar is one great antidote for pollution, and jobs are a wonderful antidote for violence, so it just seemed like the perfect place to do it.
Everything that is good for the environment, everything that's good in the fight against global warming is a job. It's a contract. It's a career.
My life has changed. You know, it's a new career for me. You know, it's something that I'm now able to give back to the community.
And we're going to give ourselves a little space. It's really changed my life, or it's starting to change my life as far as attitude and just staying positive within yourself so that you can succeed. And green has came into my life also. I never knew anything about.
In the last century's pollution-based economy, you know, there were a lot of haves and have-nots. The have-nots got stuck with the pollution, they got stuck with the toxic waste and the dumps, and we just have come to accept that. But I think if we're going to build a new economy that's a green economy, respects the earth, that's powered by clean energy, let's not have eco-apartheid. Let's make sure this new green wave lifts all boats. I think that's a key moral challenge in the new century. We just got it wrong in the last century. I think that, you know, people who are civil rights activists say, hey, listen, I'm worrying about civil rights. I'm not worrying about the trees. I'm not worrying about the polar bears. I'm worrying about, you know, integrating this school. And the people who were worrying about the forest said, hey, look, I'm going to worry about the forest. I'm not going to worry about those failing public schools. I got my own thing. And we were very individualistic about it and very fragmented. But guess what? Now, if you want to beat global warming, you got to put a lot of people to work doing stuff that's a little bit complicated, like installing solar panels and, you know, doing wind farms. And guess what? We don't have a workforce that's trained to do that because we let our schools go down the toilet. And if you're in those schools, a lot of the kids have asthma, they have diabetes. Why? Because we haven't taken care of the air. We haven't made sure that the food they're eating is healthy. So it's all interconnected now. If Dr. King were alive today, he would be standing down in the floodwaters of Katrina, down in New Orleans, with his arms around those people down there who were left behind and pointing up to the skies and saying, more of this is coming. He would be sticking up for the people and the planet. That would be Dr. King's agenda in the new century. I think that should be our agenda. So we're here in Los Angeles, and I'm going to be doing a reading from my book.
All right, thank you. Appreciate you.
How you guys doing? I'm very grateful to be here. I've heard a lot of great ideas. My name is Brandon Jones from the California Conservation Corps. And I'm the president of our green team. What would be a way to get more youth involved?
You are already a leader. You already can get the attention of your peers. You have the opportunity to say to people, look, we have a president who has a very interesting color. The president is green. Okay? The President of the United States for the first time ever is green. You are the person who can be that bridge between the President-elect and your peers to say his agenda, as a green agenda, can be the answer to almost every problem that we're facing. So I look to you to follow you for the direction.
All right, good. Hey, I'm so proud of you, man. I don't know what to do. I don't even know what to do.
I wish I could talk to you more, man.
That young guy, that's why I do this work. I want to create a million opportunities for young people like him to be the new icon of the environmental movement. When you think about environmentalism, I don't want you to think only about the polar bears. I want you to think about that young man. Let's stop seeing our urban youth and our rural youth as the problems. Let's see them as the solutions. Let's not see them as the villains, the bad guys. Everybody's scared of them. You know, lock your car doors. You know, let's see them as the potential heroes that could help us to retrofit this whole country. Let's give them a mission. It used to be in this country you could go to high school and go get a good blue-collar job and take care of your kids and send your kids on to college if they wanted to go. Those jobs have largely been sent overseas. So we want to put some green rungs back on the ladder of opportunity.
The last time I checked, General Motors wasn't General Cars or General SUVs. General Motors. What kind of motors do we need in the new century now? Right? What about wind turbines? Now, some of you think wind turbines, you know, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking windmills, you know, like from like, you know, when you're like a little kid, you know, a little windmill. And, you know, no, we're not talking about your mama's windmill. Wind turbines. 8,000 finely machined parts in each wind turbine. That's a car. Right? Each wind tower, 20 tons of steel. You could put your automakers back to work and your steel makers back to work building wind turbines that will save the earth, not SUVs that will destroy the earth. That's the kind of bailout that we need for the people and the planet. You see, that's the way forward. That's the way forward.
A lot of people say, well, we can't afford to do all this stuff. How are we afford to do all this stuff? We can't afford not to do this stuff. The wrong way to stimulate the economy is to pass out checks to everybody and tell them to, just go buy flat screen TVs or whatever they want to on a one-time, one-shot basis, which basically, when you do that, we don't make flat screen TVs. They make them in China. You just stimulated China's economy. Great, but what about ours? So we've got to have a smart stimulus and basic investment in the infrastructure of our country so we can compete in the new century. We can't just keep riding the bucking bronco of gas prices and sometimes getting involved in conflicts over oil. The game is up for carbon.
Carbon is free to dump out the back of your car or out the back of an airplane or out of a smokestack, free to dump. But it's going to cost us the whole planet. Consumption over production, debt over smart savings and thrift, and ecological destruction rather than ecological restoration. That is the economy that we built up, and that is the economy that just crashed.
You have a crisis like this is what I say. A crisis is a terrible thing to waste, right? You sometimes need a crisis in your life to get you up and moving. We're going to look back in 10 years and say these tough times were the best things that ever happened because they got the country pulling together and moving in a new direction. I was born in 1968, and that was the year that Dr. King was killed. That was the year Bobby Kennedy was killed. And even as a child, I was always fascinated with that year because that was the year I was born, and so much happened. But I feel like some hope was killed in '68, and it's taken almost 40 years for that hope to come back and that belief that we can change the country for the better.
I'm running because of what Dr. King called the fierce urgency of now.
The great thing about Barack Obama is that he doesn't have to do anything at all except what he said he was going to do on the campaign trail, and he'll be the greenest president we've ever had.
Everybody keeps asking me if I'm going to go work for Barack Obama. I haven't applied for any jobs. I got the greatest job in the world, and right now with Green for All. So yeah, my hope is that he's going to listen to folks like me, and he's got a good reputation for doing that. And next year should be a great year for this issue.
He wants to put $150 billion a year into clean energy and energy conservation. He wants to create 5 million green jobs. He wants to weatherize 1 million homes a year so they'll leak less energy.
Let's be honest, how many people the night Barack Obama won for president just made a fool of yourself, boo-hoo sobbing, just crying, slinging snot everywhere, traumatized your children? How many people just traumatized your kids? I have a 4-year-old son. He said, "Mama, what is history and why does it make Daddy cry?"
Yeah, I just wish my father had lived long enough to see him and my grandparents. I mean, I just think about all that they went through to get to a place where this was possible, and I just wish my dad was here to see it. He would have gotten a kick out of it. I've committed my life to this cause because I have 2 little boys, and to them, this is the good old days. We still have predictable weather patterns. We may not. I want them to live in a world where there are seasons, regular seasons. Weather isn't an enemy. It's just something that exists. And I also want them to live in a world where they're not called up to go overseas to fight for oil or water or who knows what resources may collapse if we don't treat this planet better. And so I think that's the best gift I can give to them is a better country. See, if we set the right example here, that will have as much influence, as much power as anything else we can do. And we've got every color, every class, every faith here in this country. We pull together and we solve the biggest problem we've ever faced, human civilization, global warming, and we solve it in a way that brings people together and lifts people out of poverty. The rest of the world will say, we want to be like them. And we'll be the world leader, not in pollution, but in solutions. And that's what the world needs right now from us.
Van Jones and his hopes for the future. When we come back, we hear from a civil rights pioneer Since the city's founding, African Americans have come to Washington from an unfriendly South, searching for tolerance and freedom. This migration helped make the nation's black minority a majority here. In 1957, Washington's population was half black. By 1970, it was 71% black. Washington had long been home to a thriving black middle class, but many businesses and residents left after devastating race riots in 1968. The 1980s cocaine epidemic and the razing of some black neighborhoods to build a subway line all led to the economic depression of the African American communities that remained in Washington.
Ben's Chili Bowl is one of the few black institutions that survived. The restaurant has been the anchor in this U Street neighborhood for half a century. When it opened in 1958, the clientele was mostly black professionals. It struggled on in an era of despair. And today it welcomes white patrons drawn to a gentrified neighborhood, a symbol of Washington's latest transformation. Across the country, white and Asian professionals, lured by the housing boom and a chance to shed a worsening commute, are moving to major cities from the suburbs. Washington is no exception. By one estimate, this city will cease to be majority black by 2015, just 6 years from now. The changing demographics have stirred up some of the old race resentments. Longtime black residents feel unwanted as they're priced out of their old neighborhoods with the construction of new condos. The gentrification is forcing a modern desegregation and bringing opportunity for some disenfranchised blacks. And yet, change hasn't come to every blighted community in Washington, and many African Americans are still struggling with chronic urban problems, poverty, bad schools, and crime, among others.
These have been the struggles for decades, and few know better about the hardships of black men and women in America than Dr. Benjamin Hooks. He's worn many hats in the long fight for civil rights: a leader of sit-ins and marches, a lawyer, a businessman, preacher, and judge. He was head of the NAACP. Now, nearly 84 years old, Hooks says he's retired. But in my lively conversation with him shortly before the inauguration, he showed no signs of slowing down.
What time? Don't let me talk too long.
Well, not at all. I'm not going to.
Do something to make me, because I'll talk forever.
You know, we often start interviews such as this talking about history, talking about the past. But I want to talk, first of all, about the present day. What do you make of this? You've seen so much over your life. What do you make of this, the first person of African American heritage to become president of the United States?
In terms of politics, it's the greatest thing that ever happened in America in my lifetime. I wasn't here with George Washington, but I've been here with everybody since then. Start with Franklin Roosevelt. I had always hoped, prayed, worked for the day when a black person could become president.
Did you think it would happen in your lifetime?
Not in my lifetime. I have to confess, I never thought, even when Obama started, I supported him, but I didn't believe he could really, I couldn't see how Hillary Clinton, the most formidable political machine in America was Hillary and Bill Clinton, the best known personalities, the greatest politicians in America. And they lost the nomination to an unknown youngster from Illinois. But I'm so glad that I shouted. I was on commentary on the night of the inauguration of the local station. Right. I actually shouted and cried. I could not believe it had come to truth.
Not only is he of African heritage, but he has the name Barack Hussein Obama.
Yes.
When you were thinking, I like him, I'd like to think he can win, but I don't think he can win, was that a factor?
Yes, well, I thought it was a kind of unwieldy name. I didn't know all of the connotations, of it. I didn't know that was Jones in the Muslim world. But I thought this, I met him and talked with him briefly, and I was impressed. I heard him on television, and he became a phenomenon. And after an hour, I said, this boy does have a chance. But America, let me say this, I think America still has a long way to go, but I'd be a fool and an ingrate if I didn't admit that America had come a long way. I know the back of the streetcar. I've ridden there. I know what it was to drive over this nation and not to be able to use the restroom, all from here to California. This nation has undergone remarkable change, but we are facing a crisis that this nation may not be able to overcome. Obama, I think is a great man, but unless he has the cooperation of both Republicans and Democrats, black and white, Muslim, Jews, Gentiles, unless we all pull together, this nation could end up like the Roman Empire, and the sun will set on us as it did on the British Empire, even worse. We've got a problem. We've got a problem, and I hope we can survive.
Now let's talk some history. You're a judge, a jurist, one of the most distinguished of your time, of any race, color, creed, religion, or gender. Take me through the most important judicial decisions made over the last, let's say, since 1960, when the civil rights movement really began to take some root.
Brown versus Board of Education.
1954.
54, that came out of the state of, was the most important judicial decision since perhaps Plessy versus Ferguson, because Thurgood Marshall took the position that we're not going to settle for half loaf. Half of our NAACP board said, Mr. Marshall, we're doing so well with this approach. What will happen if you go all the way with Brown and lose? Suppose that Supreme Court had decided that separate but equal is all right. And I haven't got time to go through, but look at sometime, you'll discover that the 9 men sitting at the time the suit was filed, 5 of them were not in favor of integration. I could name them, but I won't. Right. They died or were removed. What would have happened in Brown if they had said, you must continue to go to equal schools that are separate? Where would this nation stand in China and Japan? It was the most important decision of this century for both black and white, because it enabled all of us to lift up our heads. Now, Brown versus Board of Education has worked, Mr. Rather, in everything but education. It has failed somewhat in education, but opening the doors of hotels, restaurants, equal right to vote, all of these things are the babies of Brown versus Board of Education. And the news media, thank God for television. These white boys and men came here from Chicago and Illinois. They didn't a bit more know anything about segregation than a monkey would about building a skyscraper. They were not necessarily in favor of us, but they were appalled. And so we won the struggle because white journalists had some of the most beautiful pictures in the press, in the television, of us being beaten, knocked down, brutalized. It changed the whole current of America. And because of that, today we have a black man, thank God, as president.
In your judgment, with the election of Barack Obama, is the civil rights movement over, in our past now?
I think not. I think that there are people who say, I can't vote for Obama because he's an Arab, who really are saying, I can't vote for because he's black. When the truth is told, there are still millions of people in America whose primary reason for not voting for Obama was because he was a black man. There's just no question in my mind that if you remember the Bradley situation way back when Governor Bradley ran for governor of California, and when people polled, they said yes, they didn't mind voting for Bradley. But when they got to the voting booth, a substantial percentage went against him.
What changed with Barack Obama? There was a lot of talk during the campaign, well, you'll see come November the Bradley effect will take hold, and Barack Obama, although he's leading the polls, won't win. Well, he did win.
I think the Bradley effect did take hold, but just wasn't strong enough. In other words, the long fight since Bradley died of black folk to come forward, the long struggle of decent white people to knock down barriers, erased the big barrier. But I think if Barack Obama had been a white liberal Democrat, you know, with all the appeal he had, that the magnitude of the victory would have been even larger.
President Obama's cabinet, what are your expectations of the cabinet?
Well, I've tried to look at every cabinet pick. I knew most of them, and I think he did an outstanding job.
Were you disappointed that there weren't more African Americans in the cabinet?
No, I wasn't. I know that, you know, like any other racial group, I'd like to see 2 or 3 more. But I think that the concept of a balanced cabinet, and you do have the, what's that word, Hispanic, becoming the 2nd largest group in America, black folk moving to 3rd. Yeah, I'd like to see more than one black, but that didn't stand very much because as Obama tried to explain, it isn't who holds the cabinet post, I'm the one who holds the reins of the government in my hand.
Well, we'll see whether he can make that
and he can
fact.
make that work. then he doesn't have to have a black sitting at the Secretary of Transportation.
Well, that's true. What about Supreme Court? What are your expectations about the Supreme
Well,
Court?
if there comes a vacancy, you got to have a black on the Supreme Court. We don't have a black on the Supreme Court. We got to have one. They haven't had a black since Thurgood Marshall. Can't call Clarence Thomas black, so that's out.
That's pretty strong to say, well, I don't consider Clarence Thomas as a African American on the Supreme Court.
No, I'm saying it as strong as I can say it. I said it 10 times. I don't think he represents the majority African American view.
So it is your hope, is it your expectation?
In other words, what African Americans are for, I think they've proved it in poll after poll. They believe in affirmative action. They believe in the things NAACP has stood for. And he doesn't believe in them. And he has a right not to believe in them. He is a black conservative.
Respectfully, what happened to the idea that appointments to the Supreme Court should be based on merit, not on color, not on religion, not on gender?
Well, I have to assume that there's some black folk of merit. I don't say any black man or any white man. I want somebody who can meet all the qualifications. And I think that at this point, we didn't move that way for years. We didn't think we ought to have a woman on the Supreme Court. I was in favor of a woman. Somebody says, why? What about merit? I said, are you suggesting to me that from the beginning of this nation that we never had a woman who was qualified? It isn't that she was not qualified, it was that we were not prepared. That's the point I'm trying to make. The time has come for diversity. The time has come for broadening the horizons of our thinking. And we ought to have a black on the Supreme Court. Whites will say, well, you got a black on the Supreme Court. That's why I had to make that nasty statement. I don't mean to be nasty.
About Clarence Thomas?
Yeah, I don't want to be vindictive. I like Clarence Thomas as a person. I would like to sit down sometimes and have a cup of tea with him and try to examine his motives again. But I'm saying in terms of the viewpoint of black people, we don't have anybody who represents that.
Gotcha.
Therefore, we need somebody who does, to counterbalance what's happening on the Supreme Court, to make the arguments that Thurgood used to make.
What does it mean to you personally that an American of African heritage has become President of the United States? What do you feel down here?
Well, if I want to speak religiously, I would say we have overcome. If I want to speak on the street, I say we've come a long way, baby, a long way. If I want to be I'd get to crying if I'm not careful, because it means so much to me. As I look back at my family, every day at kitchen dinner, we talked about white folk and black folk. We had to know the white community. Black man couldn't exist in America. But when Martin King died, I started a book club in Memphis. I discovered that we had white people in this city who had never had a conversation with a black person other than that chauffeur or janitor, who knew absolutely nothing about the black community. They had no concept of how we live. So we assigned a book. Every one of them came there crying, said they never had recognized. So I heard Dr. King speak 100 times about one sentence. When I heard the first words, I just turned it off. Never heard him, never knew what he stood for, never read anything about him. And they thanked me for making them, and then I had Why We Can't Wait, his first book. And we converted a lot of people who had just never, whatever their janitor said, that was it. Whatever, and the janitor is smarter than you think. He knows he got to get along. So he knew white folk very well and gave them what they looked for, so that we were able to make a change. Martin King's speech, the 3 days that television and radio gave to that speech and his saying helped, because he was one of the greatest speakers. That day he spoke, that wasn't a speech
when
he
gave the I Have a Dream speech.
Yeah, he didn't prepare that speech for that day. He had delivered that speech before in Detroit, to a big march in Detroit, hundreds of thousands of people. And he delivered the speech, I Have a Dream. At the Washington Monument, they had a censoring committee. So everybody's speech had to be censored. And Martin wrote a very beautiful speech, and John Lewis had his speech censored, never forgave him. But when Martin got up to speak, Mahalia Jackson, whom you probably heard of, great singer, great spirit, and she had heard Martin. And when Martin delivered his speech, she said, tell him about your dream, Martin.
She shouted it out from the crowd. So
yeah, she was sitting right there under him, and he switched. And I dare you to go to that speech and find where the switch occurred, from the written speech to the I Have a Dream speech, one of the greatest since the Gettysburg Address, so far as I'm concerned. And that would never have been delivered at that occasion had it not been for Mahalia.
Nearly a half-century later, and one day after this nation remembered the legacy of Dr. King with a national holiday, the Mall in Washington, D.C. is once again filled with people from all over the country coming to witness another historic moment.
It's Obama time!
In the crowd, we caught up with our friends from the Greater Amani Church after their 17-hour bus trip from Memphis, Tennessee.
How you feel, Greater Amani? How you guys feel?
And then, the moment they came all this way to witness.
Are you prepared to take the oath, Senator?
I am.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will execute the office of President to the United States faithfully.
That I will execute
faithfully the office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States faithfully.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President. All the best wishes.
But in the words of Scripture, the time has come to set aside childish things. The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness.
And now, a final thought to leave you on this historic night. It's a reminder that our nation's march towards justice has had steps backwards as well as forwards. In 1901, an African-American congressman from North Carolina spoke for the last time on the House floor. He was the only black man in Congress, and restrictive voting laws aimed at blacks in his home state, combined with threats from white supremacists, had influenced him to not run for re-election. But George Henry White had a message for his colleagues and the nation. He stated, and I quote, "This, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress. But let me say, Phoenix-like, he will rise up someday and come again." These parting words are in behalf of an outraged, heartbroken, bruised and bleeding, but God-fearing people, faithful, industrious, loyal people, rising people, full of potential force, end quote. White's colleagues gave him thunderous applause. There would not be another African American in the United States Congress for 28 years. And that's our program for tonight. From Washington, D.C., for HDNet, Dan Rather reporting. Good night.
If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net.
Deep into our nation's history. And to understand how this inauguration fits into our complicated national story, there's no better place to begin than this city. The hopes and disappointments of the American experiment are all evident here. Most cities don't have a date of birth, but Washington, D.C. was born and has grown up along with the United States.
We as a nation have always been conscious of our brief history, and this city's vistas are evidence of our need to connect to deeper roots. The mighty dome, a cathedral to democracy atop Capitol Hill. The broad avenues lined with the departments of government. And the stark memorials to revered presidents. A towering obelisk for Washington, the tallest structure in the city. The columned shrine for the martyred Lincoln emblazoned with his poetic words. And the reflective riverbank temple for Jefferson. All this marbled grandeur was meant to awe and inspire a young nation by evoking the ancient republics of Athens and Rome. But the glories of those republics were built in large part by men in bondage. And so, too, was much of this city in its early days. Slavery existed on both sides of the Potomac River and was not abolished here until the Civil War. 75 years later, with the statue of Lincoln looking on, Washington, D.C. witnessed another chapter in its complicated history with race.
April 9th, 1939, singer Marian Anderson performs in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. The concert, organized by Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is a concert of protest. Protest against the Daughters of the American Revolution, who denied Ms. Anderson the right to sing at Constitution Hall because she was black. Here at the alternate concert site, Marian Anderson draws an audience of 75.
Died.
It was like everything shifted into slow motion, and we were numb. We were dumbfounded. We didn't know what to think or what to believe at the time, and we really didn't know what to do.
Bill Atkins was a 20-year-old college student and only a few blocks away from the Lorraine Motel where King had been shot. Atkins knew what many did not yet know, that King was dead.
And I remember I burst into the door of the radio station. They apparently had not known, and there was a young man by the name of Joby Young was the disc jockey, and he was still playing the rhythm and blues music. And I broke in the door, and I said, "Take that stuff off. Dr. King is dead." And I remember Joe Young looking at me and saying, "I didn't know." Okay, and he started playing gospel music.
Surely good. 1,000.
But while Anderson sang about freedom and liberty, the city that turned out to hear her stayed segregated.
And a generation after Anderson's concert, a large section of the country remains segregated by law, and most of the rest of it by tradition. That's when the nation once again turned its attention to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There, a 34-year-old preacher, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., spoke poetically of the chasm between the rhetoric of our founding documents and the reality of our history. 5 years later, Dr. King was dead, the victim of an assassin's bullet in Memphis, Tennessee. For the people of Memphis, especially African Americans, it was the day the dream. Good evening from Washington, D.C. Much ink has been spilled in the run-up to Inauguration Day in praise of this moment in history. That's understandable. Barack Obama has become the first African-American president of the United States, and that is historic. But it would be wrong to invest the symbolism of this occasion with a sense of self-congratulation at a journey complete, or a breathless optimism of a new beginning. As President Obama takes up residency at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, he will lead a nation facing stiff challenges. Some, like the struggling economy and ongoing wars, are of the moment. Others, like poverty, health care, and racial injustice, stretch back